the banks of the Nile, a boy lies dead, and a man is dying. Two deaths, separated by more than 30 centuries, yet ominously linked. The boy, an Egyptian pharaoh, entombed with a priceless fortune. The man, an English noble, driven to find it. His search triggered the greatest treasure hunt in history and a chain reaction of death. One by one, those who disturbed the pharaoh's tomb perished. To this day, the casualties mount. Science tracks an elusive killer, 3,000 years old. In a Pennsylvania hospital, a young woman is starving to death. The food she needs is oxygen. A simple cough has turned to lung failure. Doctors are stumped by the cause. Unknowingly, the patient's husband holds the first clue to her baffling disease. Its origins lie 6,000 miles away, in a land riddled with age-old mysteries. This is the Valley of Death. Chiseled out of the rock is the world's greatest mausoleum. 1,500 years before Christ, the pharaohs of Egypt were laid to rest here, in the Valley of the Kings. It's said you can't take it with you, but they did. Each pharaoh was buried with a king's ransom: ivory, ebony, gold. Each tomb camouflaged by the barren desert. But when archaeologists arrived centuries later, they found only withered bones. Others were here first.
There's a whole village at Kurna, near the Valley of the Kings, which is 1,000% tomb robbers, then and now. And when they can't find something, they forge it and sell you a forgery. Or when they find something, they replicate it and sell the replications. Hey, you know, this is going on since the first pharaoh was interred, these guys started.
For archaeologists, the Valley of the Kings is still the richest pickings on earth. Yet once they believed it hid no more surprises. Certainly not a lavish tomb for a minor pharaoh. His childhood, like his life, was cut short. At 9, he took the throne, and a wife. 9 years later, he was dead. Little else is known. Leaving just the skeleton of a life, he suffered a fate worse than death. He was forgotten. 3,000 years later, only a handful of men knew the name: Tutankhamun. One was an equally obscure archaeologist named Howard Carter. The other, his backer, George Edward Stanhope Molyneux Herbert, 5th Earl of Carnarvon.
He was very much the Indiana Jones, if you like, of his day. He was into all sorts of exciting adventures, and indeed he drove one of the first racing cars.
And he took part in a rally, and he had a terrible accident, and he was thrown out of the car, and owing to his injuries and subsequent ill health, his doctors told him he could no longer winter in the cold, wet climate of England.
But in those days, even if you had a common cold and you had enough money, your doctor would immediately dispatch you to Egypt to recuperate in the dry heat.
That resulted in ultimately coming together with Carter,
and so began the great quest to find the tomb of King Tut.
A low-born commoner and a wealthy lord were unlikely partners in what experts deemed a shot in the dark.
It was a shot in the dark. This was a time there were no metal detectors, no sophisticated sonar equipment to look into pockets and hollows underneath the soil or the sand. So it was a shot in the dark for everybody but Howard Carter.
Unlike his predecessors, Carter methodically dug up the Valley of the Kings, yard by yard. He found acres of disappointment.
Just before Christmas in 1921, Carnarvon sent for Carter here at Highclere Castle to tell him that he could no longer afford to go on funding what appeared to be a useless project. Carter explained there was very little left to do and begged for one more season, which Carnarvon agreed, but made it absolutely clear that that was the final season.
On the third day, workers uncovered stone steps leading to a hidden doorway, stamped with an ancient seal. It was the mark of royalty. After 5 years of bad news, Carter sent his partner a ray of hope.
Carnarvon was having tea with his daughter Evelyn here in the hall at Highclere Castle when they got a telegram saying, "Think of discovered entrance to magnificent tomb with seal still intact, awaiting your arrival."
While Carnarvon was on his way, something unnerving happened to Carter.
Carter lived on his own, and to keep himself company he'd bought a canary, and the boys had all been very excited by this yellow bird, and they said this wonderful yellow bird will lead us to the tomb. And as he went back to send the telegram, having just found the tomb, his houseboy ran out carrying a bundle of yellow feathers, and he said, "Master, I heard a rustling, and when I went, the cobra was eating the canary. This is an omen. This is unlucky. Master, don't open the tomb. Don't go near it."
And the workers naturally leapt to the cobra, which is on the headdress of every pharaoh, and the pharaoh had come and eaten the symbol of hope, and it was going to be a miserable time, and everybody was going to have, terrible things would happen, and so on.
And Carter said, "Don't be such a damn fool. Just make sure the cobra is no longer in the house."
By dusk on November 26, 1922, workers had excavated a second doorway bearing the seal of Tutankhamun. It also bore the hallmark of thieves, a patch where the tomb had been broken into. It seemed Howard Carter was 3,000 years too late. Alone in the passage stood Lord Carnarvon, his daughter, Lady Evelyn Herbert, Carter's assistant, and Carter himself. Before him lay the find of his life, or a tomb for his dreams. An eternity passed, while Carter peered into the gloom on the other side. At last, Carnarvon whispered, "Can you see anything?" "Yes," Carter replied. "Wonderful things."
Carnarvon and Lady Evelyn and Pecky Callender, they're behind him, going, what is it, for Pete's sake? And finally he says, wonderful things, full of emotion. He could hardly speak. And he looks in and he sees this chamber just cluttered with treasures.
The entire room glittered, and all that glittered was gold. Carter was stunned.
We'd never dreamed of anything like this. A whole museum full of objects, some the like of which we had never seen. The thing was overwhelming.
There's never been a pharaoh found in any way almost intact. People have been searching for them. Dozens and dozens of great pharaohs, the richest people, the most powerful people of all of history, in perfect condition. We're talking about things that you look at now, you cannot believe that these are the thousands of years old that they are. It's awesome. I can't think of another dig that's as good as this. Can't think of it.
Carter later said they looked around, then left. But evidence says they did more that night than just look.
Carter and Carnarvon were not allowed by their franchise to enter the tomb without an Egyptian Organization of Antiquities official present. And they never said they entered it. They waited. They looked in, they saw wonderful things, they went bananas, and they sealed up the hole, and they waited 3 days for the guy to get down from Cairo to go with them. Would you have done that after 10 years of extraordinary struggle? Would I have done that? No, I would not have done that. And they did what you and I would have done. They went in, and they spent all night in there.
The smallest, Lady Evelyn, led the way inside. 3 men, 1 woman, and somewhere, a dead boy.
It's dark. You're in there, the first person in 1,000 years to be inside the tomb of a person who had died. There must have been a little of the old haunting, the hauntedness that comes with that. Then there's fear, because they were in there illegally. They were like the thieves of ancient times. The place was a shambles because the thieves, and there were 2 sets of thieves, had gone in there, and there is some indication that at least one of the 2 bands of thieves was caught. The chances are if they were caught in the act, head off, and that's it.
The discoverers began to count their blessings. They would eventually total 5,000. The tomb of Tutankhamun was the greatest find in history. Overnight, Carnarvon, Carter, and Tut became celebrities.
They felt, just total triumph, victory. And they'd been laughed at, they'd been mocked. It'd been kind of a whispering campaign, they'd lost their marbles, And here they have it.
Tut's tomb also made history as the first dig ever preserved on the newfangled medium of motion pictures. This piece of celluloid preserved the discoverers. Carter, as he was photographed by Carnarvon. Howard Carter was a star.
The personal reward, I believe, for an archaeologist, which everyone can see, is the fame. After a major discovery, of course, the public and the newspaper and the media and the TV and everyone will run after you. Then at the beginning, archaeologists can like that. But at the end, fame is not fun. I think fame is a curse.
Drunk on success, the discoverers made a fateful mistake. Tut's tomb would become one of the biggest stories in history. But to recoup his expenses, Lord Carnarvon sold exclusive rights to one newspaper.
And that was the London Times. That was the gentleman's paper, This was the nobility's paper. And he signed a deal with them which caused him unending grief. Stupid thing for him to do, but anyway, he did it.
Carter would live to regret the mistake. Carnarvon would not. The man who bankrolled the search for King Tut first came to Egypt for his health. That decision would prove fatal. One morning in the spring of 1923, Lord Carnarvon cut himself, exactly where a mosquito bit him days before. The wound didn't heal. Days later, on a trip to Cairo, Carnarvon was racked by fever.
I'm sorry to tell you that C is seriously ill.
His secretary, Richard Beathell, sent Howard Carter bad news. The mosquito bite was infected.
That poisoned bite has spread all over him. And he's got blood poisoning.
As fever turned to chills, Beathell's concern turned to fear. He notified Carnarvon's wife in England, who at once summoned a specialist and flew to Cairo. Carnarvon was beyond help.
At the moment that he died, all the lights in Cairo went out. And at the time, all the utilities in Cairo were run by the British Army, and they could find no way of turning them back on and could find no reason for them to have gone off. And 20 minutes later, they all came on again.
At that very moment, something else unexplainable happened, more than 2,000 miles away in England.
Carnarvon's little fox terrier, Susie, was asleep in her basket in the housekeeper's room at Highclere Castle. And at the very second that he died, Susie sat up in her basket, howled and dropped down dead.
Lady Evelyn buried her father on a hill overlooking his beloved Highclere. There she also laid to rest her Egyptian adventure.
When Carnarvon died, it was a tremendous shock to my mother, and it all happened so very quickly. She was only just 21, and she adored her father, and I don't think she ever completely recovered, because she never went back to Egypt after his death.
Like the king whose slumber he disturbed, the English noble would not rest in peace. Carnarvon's body was barely cold when the world's press named the culprit. Inscribed within the tomb, wrote one reporter, was a curse that warned, "I will kill all those who cross this threshold." Another paper reported a curse that was eerily accurate. "They who enter this sacred tomb shall swift be visited by wings of death." For Carnarvon, death indeed came on wings. Howard Carter shrugged off the curse and went back to work, but he couldn't shake the loss. Carnarvon had shielded the prickly archaeologist from a curious world. As the world crowded in, tragedy would again strike Carter. Fascinated by Tut's treasure and undaunted by his curse, a plague of tourists descended on his tomb. One of the few allowed inside was the railroad tycoon George J. Gould, guided by Carter himself. For his private tour, Gould paid a heavy price. That night, he came down with fever. The next day, he died. A British industrialist suffered the same fate. It seemed the curse of Tutankhamun had struck again. It wasn't the last time an intruder would die of unnatural causes.
It was going to be like our honeymoon, because we never took one when we got married.
Among the visitors to Tut's tomb in 1995 were Gary Munson and his wife Cheryl. For Cheryl, a student of art history, it was the trip of a lifetime.
Well, everybody we knew we were going there. As soon as she talked to somebody, the first thing she was talking about was going over there.
The sights so amazed her, seeing them wasn't enough.
We were going down the stairs into the tombs and looking at how the dark blues and the reds that were painted on there. She slowly leans over and she's looking real close at it, and then she starts slowly bringing her hand up to it until she finally started touching and rubbed some of the paint. And then the guide saw her, yell at her for touching it. She turns around and says, "My teacher said if you ever get over here, you have to touch the paint no matter what they say, because you're never going to get a chance to do it again."
When the Munsons returned to Pennsylvania, Cheryl's trouble began.
Maybe 3 weeks after we got back, she started getting a little slight cough now and then. And it just progressively got worse and worse till finally she's coughing most of the time.
When Gary urged Cheryl to see a doctor, she refused. She'd seen her fill during a weary battle with Hodgkin's disease.
She had chemotherapy, radiation treatment, just about everything you go through with a cancer treatment. And she did not want to go back to doctors after that. Finally, she had to go.
I first met Mrs. Munson when she was already a patient in the intensive care unit. And at that time, she was in critical condition. She started out with some weight loss, weakness, some shortness of breath. And by the time she was admitted to the hospital for a workup, there were already major signs of disease that were present. A definite involvement of both lung fields, and this had progressed.
They suspected it might have been Hodgkin's acting up again, because the symptoms were something like that. But after a day or two, they ruled that out. They started thinking something was the matter with their lungs, but they never really got the chance to find out, because it moved along too quick. So they decided they were going to have to do a lung biopsy.
Both from her lung secretions, as well as subsequently from her lung itself, we were able to identify a fungus, Aspergillus niger, which is a mold, and this was very likely the precipitating event of her illness.
Microscopic spores from the fungus are easily inhaled. Healthy bodies resist them, but Cheryl's immune system was crippled from her battle with Hodgkin's. The spores invaded cell after defenseless cell, destroying as they went. Cheryl Munson was starving for oxygen. Ten days after she entered the hospital, her lungs gave out. She was 38 years old. The case wasn't quite closed. The mystery was the scene of the crime. Where did Cheryl Munson rendezvous with her killer? For ancient Egyptians, eternal life required a well-preserved corpse. The result was a funeral to die for. The body needed not only preserving, but protecting. To ward off evil, no fewer than 143 amulets and charms were wrapped inside the burial shroud of Tutankhamun. And these were just the first line of defense.
I will take you now to visit one tomb that contained the first curse ever existed. This is the tomb of Hesse. It's dated back to more than 4,000 years, and it has at the entrance of the tomb a very interesting curse inscription.
From pharaohs to peasants, the Egyptians guarded their graves with spells and curses.
As for any person who will enter this tomb,
David Silverman is professor of Egyptology at the University of Pennsylvania. He's translated dozens of ancient curses, including the 4,000-year-old curse of Hesse.
the curse is a prohibition against anyone who comes into the tomb having eaten a certain kind of food that was forbidden, like pork or fish.
Something unclean, or something unclean connected with his soul.
Or having committed an act of sexual impurity, in this case, adultery.
And after he made love to all women.
And if it so happened, then the individual might be punished in this life or in the afterlife.
Therefore will be judged in front of the great God.
For Professor Silverman, not every curse is academic.
I received a call from a physician, and he told me this very interesting and very unfortunate story about a woman who had gone with her husband to Egypt and had gone into the tomb of King Tut, and it turned out that she had picked up a fungus.
At that time, we were aware that we had Aspergillus niger isolated from the specimens that we took from Mrs. Munson, and we were also aware of her trip.
She had to pick up something over there.
So what we had to find out was whether these molds were also present in the tombs that she visited.
It's the only place it could have come from.
And so we called the Egyptology department at the University of Pennsylvania.
So they were wondering if this had anything to do with the curse.
It was very important for us also to know whether this had ever been described before.
It had. In 1923, 2 men died suddenly after visiting Tut's tomb. What doctors chalked up to fever was reported as Tut's curse. Two more sudden deaths followed. Pecky Callender, who helped Carter break into the tomb, and Arthur Mace, who helped remove its contents. The true killer lurks on the very walls of the tomb. To Howard Carter, it looked like chipped paint, till he looked closer.
The walls are covered with small brown fungus growths, the original germs of which were probably introduced either with the plaster or the paint, and were nourished by the enclosed humidity from the plaster after the chamber had been sealed up.
The fungus is Aspergillus niger. In the warm, damp tomb, it thrived, the only living thing for 3,000 years. When Cheryl Munson arrived with a crippled immune system, she was a prime host for the fungus.
I think by connecting our case, which is a modern-day case, to the visit and the tombs itself, we were able to have a direct link to what might have happened to the archaeologist who had visited some time ago. And I am rather confident that in at least some of these cases, that Aspergillus could have easily played a role.
Science was ready to close the file on Cheryl Munson, but not on Tut's curse. November 11th, 1925. In Egypt's Valley of the Kings, a boy who died more than 1,000 years before Christ is about to be resurrected. Tutankhamun lies within 3 coffins, one inside the other. The innermost, nearly 300 pounds of solid gold. Inside the gold coffin lies an object even more breathtaking, the mummy itself, adorned with a stunning death mask of the boy king. As a human likeness, only a handful of the greatest statues can hold a candle to its brilliance.
That gold mask alone is one of the single most beautiful objects in all of mankind's history, not just Egyptian.
The corpse of Tutankhamun lay beneath 13 layers of linen. As Howard Carter peeled them away, he discovered the precious amulets hidden inside to ward off evil. Over the centuries, the resins and oils used to mummify the body had turned to glue. To retrieve the amulets, Carter performed a radical operation. He hacked up the corpse. The outcome of this autopsy was fatal. Within 14 days, 2 of the participants suddenly died. By 1927, 6 men were dead of a single apparent cause, the mummy's curse.
This is really such a well-preserved mask. You can see these copper eyelashes around the stone eyes here.
Dr. Rosalie David is the queen of mummies. As curator of Egyptology for England's Manchester University Museum, she's autopsied 35 mummies, more than anyone else. She also pioneered a way to do it without destroying them.
So we have a mummy of an old lady here using x-rays and using endoscopes. We go in through existing bodily holes and we take tissue samples and we can use these for DNA identification. And also we hope in the future it may be possible to detect viral and bacterial DNA in the mummies. So this is a much better method of working.
The endoscope lets Dr. David examine the corpse without even unwrapping it, in complete safety.
Working with a mummy can be hazardous, both for the operator and for the mummy, because the operator could breathe in spores from the mummy dust, and in reverse, the operator could deposit bacteria or moisture onto the surface of the mummy, thus causing decomposition.
Though dead for thousands of years, a mummy is alive with bacteria, some harmless, some lethal.
We wear protective clothing when we work with the mummies, and this protects us against the fungal spores.
Rosalie David knows the true fate of those who disturbed the bones of Tutankhamun. Their crude autopsy unleashed an invisible killer.
In the old days, the operators didn't wear protective clothing at all. They simply wore their everyday clothes, and so there could be an interchange of damage between the operator and the mummy.
A mummy's dust. Such was the peril in Tut's coffin. Yet 70 years ago, the world remained spellbound by a hex, warning of death on wings. By 1929, 13 people with links to Tut's tomb were dead, and those with no link were spooked. Anonymous packages began arriving at the British Museum. They held Egyptian artifacts from collectors who sought to purge their closets and ease their minds.
And this has gone on to modern times. A few years ago, a couple came in with an Egyptian object, or what they claimed was an Egyptian object, and they were concerned that it might have a curse associated with it. And they asked me to examine it. In fact, it didn't have a curse. It probably wasn't an ancient Egyptian object at all. And several months later, I had a call from the police asking me to be an expert witness in a case wherein the husband had killed his wife, and it was this couple, and he had claimed that he had killed his wife because of the curse that was on this object.
The first victim of Tut's curse, the wealthy Lord Carnarvon, bequeathed to his heirs a case of jitters.
After my great-grandfather's death, obviously my grandfather inherited Highclere. And my grandfather was very concerned about the curse of King Tut, and actually wouldn't allow the name Tutankhamun to be spoken in the castle. Highclere Castle on a cold, wintry, windy night can be pretty frightening, and if you add the supposed curse of the pharaohs to that, you can get pretty spooked. Well, after my grandfather died, we had to do an inventory of the castle, and of course, being such a huge place, that did take rather a lot of time. And at last it was completed, and as a family we were all gathered here in the castle, along with Robert Taylor, my grandfather's butler, who was one of the great British butlers. And my father turned to Robert Taylor and said, "Well, thank goodness that's all over with now, Robert." And Robert Taylor turned to my father and said, "Well, my lord, it's everything apart from the Egyptian stuff." As you can imagine, all of us as a family were absolutely amazed by this comment. And we said, "Well, what Egyptian stuff, Robert?" And he said, "Well, if you'll follow me," he said, "I'll lead you to the secret cabinets."
The Egyptian government kept careful track of every object found in Tut's tomb. Yet 17 small artifacts were somehow smuggled out. Carter and Carnarvon found the lure of treasure irresistible. Few in their place would not.
When I dug in Morgantina in Sicily, this Greek town, did I put a memento into my pocket? Yes, I did. A couple of silver coins, no big deal, but I guess everybody does. Carter did, Carnarvon did.
The man who found Tut's tomb was among the few to escape its curse. Almost. When he made the greatest find in archaeology, Howard Carter had the world at his feet. Then he tripped.
He had the environment. He had dust storms. His good friend Carnarvon is dead. He is under huge pressure from the Egyptians. He's under enormous pressure from the press that didn't get the story. He has a tiny little space to work in. He's going crazy. His temper is frayed. He's a very volcanically temperamental guy. Anyway, Howard Carter just gets to the point where he can't take it any longer. And he cracked.
Obsessed with access to what he felt was his tomb, Carter one day locked everyone out, including the Egyptians.
That's really a big mistake. Because if a foreigner is working in a country, he has to know that he's a guest. And if you are a guest, you have to respect the people that you're working with.
And when he did this rash act of putting these enormous iron gates and locking it, it was the English takeover of something that the people of Egypt owned, which was true. And they went crazy, and they threw him out.
After a year's exile, Carter was allowed back at a terrible price. He had to surrender his claim to Tut's treasure. Fate spared him to live day after day with the treasure he found, but could never possess. Perhaps the ultimate curse. Carter spent the next decade in the Valley of the Kings, cataloging Tut's 5,000 wonderful things. On March 2nd, 1939, at 65, he died of normal causes. Like the tomb of Tutankhamun, Carter's grave is guarded by wings. Before he died, Carter made amends with Tut. The pharaoh's bones were put back together, and he was laid to rest in his tomb. He wouldn't rest in peace. In a chain reaction of tragedy, his curse claimed 5 more victims. First, Lady Carnarvon died suddenly of an insect bite, just like her husband. Then Richard Beathell, Lord Carnarvon's secretary, died mysteriously in his sleep. 3 months later, Beathell's father, Lord Westbury, leapt from a 7th-floor window to his death. He left a note blaming his son's death on the curse of King Tut. On the way to the cemetery, Lord Westbury's hearse struck an 8-year-old boy. At the exact moment the boy died, so did an employee of the British Museum, whose field was Egyptology. For 3 decades, the curse lay dormant, till the last time Tut's slumber was disturbed. Near the banks of the Nile, the pharaoh Tutankhamun was buried, with 5,000 priceless belongings. His royal treasures were meant to accompany him on his journey to the afterlife. Instead, they took a detour. In the 1970s, Egypt bowed to popular demand and sent scores of Tut's relics on a world tour. Egypt's director of antiquities dreamed he would die if the treasures left the country. 3 months later, he was killed in an auto accident, the 25th victim of Tut's curse. The same day Tut's mask was packed for London, an Egyptian official who scoffed at the curse died of a heart attack. Among the sightseers when the treasure reached London was the first person to enter Tut's tomb, Lady Evelyn Herbert.
My mother had never seen the final sarcophagus because they hadn't reached that particular chamber before her father died. At the time of the exhibition in London, the television and radio used to ring up my mother and say, tell us about the curse, and she'd laugh and say, well, I'm alive and kicking at 70, and I don't believe in it. I think it was a very exciting time for a very traumatic, possibly stressful, because she was seeing the things that she realised her father had never seen after all his years of effort. And coming out of the museum, probably on her 5th visit, she had a major stroke and was paralysed from then on. But of course it could easily have been a coincidence brought on by stress and trauma.
Coincidence has managed to account for most of the victims of Tut's curse. To explain the rest, science went back for a closer look.
In any of the inscriptions that occur in the tomb, there are none that can be considered a curse. So what we would consider, or as an Egyptologist I would consider an ancient Egyptian curse, does not occur in the tomb of King Tut.
The so-called curse was unwittingly spawned by its first victim. When Lord Carnarvon gave sole coverage of Tut's tomb to the London Times, rival papers were outraged. At Carnarvon's death, they got even by printing rumors of a curse. Even the bizarre goings-on when Carnarvon died can be explained.
All the lights went out in Cairo when Carnarvon died. The lights always go out in Cairo at all times. All of this stuff took off. It was just like anything today. An outrageous series of half-truths and some truth and some lies, some made up. It was great. Very potent stuff. Still is.
When Tut's tomb was visited by Carnarvon's no-nonsense granddaughter, even she thought twice.
I'd been warned following my stroke that I had a bad heart, and I saw there were steps down and a hill down. Even young people were coming up that hill and those steps, panting, and I felt that discretion was the better part of valour, and I didn't want another headline, King Tut kills again.
The son of Lord Carnarvon talked about how he doesn't really believe in the curse, but he said there really isn't any way to explain a lot of what went on. And that has kept the curse alive.
Accidents can happen. Like it happened with me many times, accidents like this. I was excavating in my early days in a site in the Delta. The first year, in the same day that I put the artifacts inside the museum, someone called me inside the museum and said, "Your uncle died." The next year, in the same day, they said, "Your aunt died." And the third year, my cousin died. Anyone who will see that, he will talk about the curse. And even, when I discovered a sealed tomb with beautiful 4 statues, and those statues are incredible, incredible. And I was the first one to see them. Next day, the earthquake happened in Cairo. Third day, I had a heart attack. Reporters took it as a fact, and they talked about the curse.
No matter how you try to kill it, it's like a phoenix, it resurfaces over and over again. But then again, no matter how much we hear that there isn't a Loch Ness monster or that there aren't any UFOs through logical means, we still believe in them, don't we?
It's marvelous human nature. We need this sort of stuff. We love it. Even if I know it's all made up, I love it. I love the Tut curse.
As curator of the Tutankhamun exhibit during its American tour, Thomas Hoving one night found himself face to face with the cursed pharaoh.
And I reached up and I grabbed that thing in my hands and I lifted it off the pedestal. And I was looking right, 6 inches right in those gorgeous, beautiful eyes. And I turned around, right, left, there's nobody around, and I gave him a big fat kiss right in the lips. And I'll tell you something, that curse went away from me. I was clean. I'm fine.
Tut's treasure now resides in the Cairo Museum, where millions have gazed on it in awe. The museum is also the humble tomb for dynasties of pharaohs. But Tutankhamun still rests in the Valley of the Kings. Once the most obscure pharaoh, he's now the most famous. Ancient Egyptians went to their graves with an undying belief. Say my name, and I shall live. Tutankhamun, a household name, now has what he wanted most: immortality. He owes it to the very men who disturbed his tomb. They also left him the kind of protection other pharaohs would kill for. A curse that would make even skeptics tread lightly.